The chamber was enormous. It had to be. When 47 civilizations needed to sit in the same room and argue, the room had to be big enough to hold every size, shape, and smell that the galaxy had to offer. The Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Council floated in the neutral space between three star systems, a station so large that it had its own gravity, its own weather on the upper floors, and its own political problems that had nothing to do with the rest of the galaxy. On most days, the chamber was noisy with small arguments, trade routes, border disputes, mining rights on dead moons, the usual business of running a civilization that spanned hundreds of star systems and thousands of years of shared history. But on this day, the chamber was quiet. That was unusual. When 47 species go quiet at the same time, something is very wrong. At the center of the room, a holographic display was running. It showed a single planet, blue and green, wrapped in white clouds, sitting in a small and unremarkable solar system on the outer edge of the galaxy's spiral arm. It was not a large planet. It was not in a particularly important location. It had no rare minerals that the Council didn't already have in abundance somewhere else. By every measure that the Council used to rank the importance of a world, this planet should have been a footnote. The planet was called Earth. Its people called themselves humans. Counselor of the Vel Ascendancy stood at the speaker's platform. She was tall, pale, blue, and had been in politics long enough to know when a room full of powerful people was genuinely afraid. She had seen that look many times before. She was seeing it now. "I will present the timeline," she said, her voice calm and clear. "I ask that all members hold their questions until I am finished. What you are about to hear will require patience." No one argued. That alone said a great deal. She began with a number, 240 years. That was how long it had been since the Council's Deep Space Monitoring Network had first flagged Earth as a world of minor interest. At that time, the humans had been burning coal to power their machines. They had been fighting wars with metal weapons and gunpowder. They had no understanding of atomic energy, no concept of faster than light travel, and no idea that the rest of the galaxy existed. The Council's xenobiologists had looked at the data, given the species a threat classification of Class 3 primitive, and moved on. Huna Class 3 meant dangerous to themselves, but not to anyone else. The galaxy had hundreds of Class 3 worlds. Most of them burned themselves out before they ever reached space. The ones that didn't usually took between 800 and 2,000 years to develop meaningful space flight. The Council had seen it happen many times. There was a process. It was slow. It was predictable. It made sense. Drea moved to the next data point. 160 years ago, the humans had split the atom, not discovered it, split it on purpose. They had figured out how to release the energy locked inside matter and had immediately built weapons with it. The Council's observers had flagged this as concerning but not alarming. Many species discovered atomic energy. Most of them used it destructively before they learned to use it wisely. Then came the next point. 130 years ago, the humans had landed on their own moon, a cold, airless rock with no atmosphere and no resources worth the effort, and they had gone there anyway, not because they needed to, because they wanted to see if they could. The observers had updated Earth's threat file and gone back to other Business, Drea paused and looked around. The chamber. Every face, every cluster of eyes, every set of sensory organs. That counted as a face among the 47 species present was pointed at her. 60 years ago, she continued, the humans had achieved fusion power, clean, near limitless energy, the kind of energy that changes everything. Around the same time, they had begun terraforming the second planet in their solar system, not in the slow, gaseous way the Council recommended for new space-faring civilizations. They had done it fast and loud, crashing ice-heavy comets into the planet's surface to seed it with water, pumping greenhouse gases into its thin atmosphere to trap heat, seeding it with engineered bacteria designed to break down rock and produce oxygen. It was messy and aggressive and against every environmental protocol the Council had ever written. It was also working. 40 years ago, the humans had launched their first-generation ships, not small scout vessels, full colony ships carrying thousands of people and decades of supplies aimed at the nearest star. Systems aimed at systems that the Council had long since claimed and settled. 20 years ago, the first of those ships had arrived. Drea let that sit for a moment. The humans had not asked permission. They had not sent a diplomatic message ahead of the ships. They had simply arrived, found the Council's colony worlds, studied them from a respectful distance, and then gone to the next system on their list. When the Council's patrol ships had intercepted the human vessels and demanded they identify themselves and explain their presence, the humans had been polite, curious, and completely unimpressed by the size of the patrol ships. They had shared their names, the name of their world, and a basic summary of their journey. Then they had asked if the Council wanted to trade. The patrol commander had filed a report describing the humans as alarmingly calm for a species that had never encountered another civilization before. He had recommended further observation. The Council had agreed. Now Doug came to the part that had made the chamber go quiet. 10 years ago, the Council's monitoring systems had begun picking up something strange. The growth rate of human space faring capability was not following any known model. Every species the Council had ever catalogued followed a curve. Slow at first, then faster, then a long plateau. As the civilization stabilized and found its limits, it was natural. It happened everywhere. The human curve had no plateau. It went up and then it went up faster and then faster. Still there. Ship designs were changing every few years, not every few centuries. Their weapons technology, which the Council's analysts had initially rated as primitive, had doubled in effectiveness 3 times in the last decade alone. Their population across their home system and the colonies they had planted in nearby systems was growing at a rate that the Council's demographic models kept rejecting as an input error. It wasn't an input error. Xenobiologist from the Hareth Collective had been brought in to explain it. He had spent 2 years studying the human data and had delivered his conclusion to the Council's scientific committee in a voice that had been very carefully kept steady. Humans, he explained, did not have an upper limit that the Council could identify. Every other species in the known galaxy had some natural break on their development, a resource limit, a biological ceiling on processing speed or creativity, a social structure that resisted certain kinds of change. These limits were not weaknesses. They were simply the shape of what was possible. For any given species, humans appeared to have no such shape. What they had instead was something the xenobiologist had struggled to put a name to. He had eventually called it compulsive problem solving. Humans did not encounter an obstacle and accept it. They did not root around it. In the most efficient way, they attacked it. They threw resources and creativity and stubbornness at it until it broke, or until they found a new way to think about it that made it irrelevant. Then they moved on to the next obstacle and did the same thing. This was the xenobiologist had noted in his conclusion extremely effective. It was also, he had added in a quieter voice, something that no amount of military force reliably stopped. You could beat a human. You could beat 1,000 humans. You could destroy a human city. The humans would look at what had happened, figure out why it had happened, and come back having specifically solved for the thing that had beaten them. He had paused before his final sentence. Then he had said, every civilization in this council achieved peace before it reached the stars. The humans reached the stars, still fighting each other. They did not see war as a catastrophe to be avoided at all costs. They saw it as a problem to be solved, and they had been solving it over and over for their entire history. That report had been sitting in a sealed file for 8 years. Drea had opened it 3 weeks ago. She had read it 4 times before she fully believed it. Now she stood in front of the 47 civilizations that made up the Galactic Council and delivered the conclusion she had reached after 3 weeks of very little sleep. The humans were coming, not aggressively, not yet, but they were expanding, and they were not going to stop, and they were very specifically not the kind of species that could be frightened into stopping. The Council could attempt diplomacy. She personally believed that was the correct choice, but she had been outvoted before she even finished making the argument. Ambassador Vale of the Keth Dominion had stood up and said what several members were already thinking. The humans were a threat. Every data point proved it. The correct response to a threat was to eliminate it before it became unmanageable. The KTH had the largest fleet in the council. They were volunteering to lead. The vote had not been close. 31 in favor, 9 against, 7 abstentions. The order had gone out. 12 armadas, over 30,000 warships, the largest military force the council had ever assembled, and sent in a single direction, pointed at one small blue-green planet on the edge of the galaxy that had until very recently been considered too primitive to matter. Drea had watched the fleet leave from the observation deck of the station. She had stood there for a long time after the last FTL signature had faded. She had looked at the empty space where they had been and thought about the xenobiologist's report about the humans in their compulsive problem solving, about the way they attacked obstacles until the obstacles broke, and then she had thought about what happened when you pointed 30,000 warships at a species like that. She had gone back to her office and started writing a letter. She did not know who she would send it to. She wrote it anyway. It began with 4 words that she suspected history would eventually agree with. We have made a mistake. Admiral Shreth had fought in 6 wars. He had commanded fleets against the Borvani breakaway states, crushed the Hearth border rebellion, and once personally led a boarding action against a rogue weapons platform in the Veal system that had been shooting at Everything within range for no reason. Anyone ever fully explained, he was not. A careful man by nature, but he was an experienced one. He knew what a winning position looked like. He knew what a dangerous enemy felt like, and he did not feel danger as his 300 warships dropped out of faster than light travel. At the edge of the solar system, what he felt was mild curiosity. The system was small, one yellow star, 8 planets, a belt of rocks between the 4th and 5th planets, a scattering of moons. The humans had colonized their 2nd and 4th planets to some degree, and his sensors showed industrial signatures across several moons of the large gas giants further out, some satellite networks, some construction activity in the asteroid belt. Nothing that looked particularly threatening. He had expected a scramble, a burst of panicked communications, military ships rushing to form some kind of desperate defensive line, the kind of chaos that happened when a primitive species suddenly realized it was not alone and that the things that had just arrived were not friendly. Instead, his communications officer turned from her console with a slightly confused expression and told him that something was hailing them. Single human vessel was sitting at the edge of the system. It was not large. It was roughly cylindrical, dark gray, and built in a way that Shreth's engineers would later describe as functional but not elegant. It had clearly not been designed to look impressive. It had been designed to work. His sensors put its weapons output at roughly 1/8 of one of his destroyers. His shields alone could absorb everything it could fire for approximately 3 hours before showing meaningful stress. He almost didn't answer the hail. He answered it because ignoring it seemed beneath him. The face that appeared on his screen was a human woman. She looked to be somewhere in the middle portion of her species, relatively short lifespan. Her hair was dark and cut short. Her uniform was plain dark blue with small markings on the chest and shoulders that his translator system identified as rank insignia. She was sitting in what appeared to be a command chair on a bridge that looked clean and organized and very, very calm. She said in a language his translator needed 2 seconds to process. This is Commander Lena Vasquez of the USCS Unyielding, representing the United Earth Admiral. Tai, you have entered sovereign human space. Can I ask your intentions? Shreth studied her for a moment. She was not afraid. He had seen the faces of species meeting a council fleet for the first time. There was usually fear. There was usually awe. There was sometimes aggression born from panic. What there was almost never, under any circumstances, was the calm, polite, slightly waiting expression currently on this human's face. It reminded him of someone who had made a reservation at a restaurant and was waiting to see if the staff had lost it. He decided not to answer her question. He told his weapons officer to fire a single warning shot across the human ship's path, not close enough to damage it, just close enough to make the situation clear. The shot fired. Single bolt of directed plasma crossed the Unyielding's bow close enough that the human ship should have rocked from the energy displacement. The human ship did not rock. Its shields absorbed the displacement without any visible strain. Vasquez looked to her left at someone off-screen and then looked back at Shreth. I'm going to assume that was a greeting, she said. I'd like to respond, but I want to give you a chance to reconsider your approach first. You have about 30 seconds. Shreth opened his mouth to order a second shot, a full weapons lock this time, something that would make the point more clearly. His sensor officer made a sound that in the PVI language translated roughly as that is not possible. 12 human ships had appeared. They had not arrived from FTL. They had not come from the direction of the inner planets. They had simply become visible. They had been in the asteroid belt all along, running dark, with no active emissions of any kind. What using the rocks in their own cold hole plating to hide from every scan his fleet had performed in the 90 seconds. Since their arrival, 90 seconds. His fleet had been in the system for 90 seconds and had already missed 12 warships. These 12 were larger than the unyielding, not dramatically larger but larger, and they had not been running dark because they were hiding in fear. They had been running dark because they were waiting. They were positioned. Shreth realized with a cold feeling he had not expected. In a pattern, a specific pattern, they surrounded his advanced formation on 4 sides, including from below on the system's plane and from above it. The geometry was not accidental. Someone had put those ships there before his fleet arrived. His communications officer said very quietly that Commander Vasquez was still on the line in her 30 seconds. We're almost up. Shreth said nothing for a moment. He was doing the math. 300 ships versus 13. Those were still good numbers, even accounting for the ambush positioning. His ships were individually stronger. His fleet had more total firepower. He ordered the attack. What happened next lasted 19 minutes. He lost 120 ships, not because the humans were invincible, not because their weapons were overwhelmingly superior. He lost them because the humans fought in a way that his tactical systems were not built to predict. They did not hold a defensive line. They did not try to protect a fixed position. They moved constantly, splitting his formations with precise hit-and-run strikes, targeting his fleet communication relays. First, what then his sensor platforms, then the ships that coordinated fleet movement. In 11 minutes, his 300 warships had been effectively broken into small groups that could no longer talk to each other clearly or see the full picture of the battle. Then the humans had gone after the isolated groups one at a time. When Shreth gave the order to retreat, he had 180 ships left and a feeling in his chest that he had not felt since very early in his career. It took him a moment to identify it. When he did, he said nothing because naming it out loud seemed like the wrong thing to do. It was the feeling of having been made to look like a fool by someone who had been several steps ahead. The whole time, he pulled his fleet back to the system's edge, put them into a defensive hold, and called his remaining officers together, and he asked for damage reports, casualty figures, and tactical analysis of what had just happened. His officers gave him numbers and observations. He listened to all of it and then sat with it quietly for a while. What kept pulling at him was not the losses. Losses happen in war. What pulled at him was the behavior of the human ships in those 19 minutes. They had not fought like a species defending its home in desperation. They had not made the kind of mistakes that came from fear or surprise or unpreparedness. They had fought like a force that had practiced this exact engagement many times before. The positions, the targeting sequence, the way they had separated his fleet into pieces so efficiently that it almost seemed choreographed. This was not improvisation. This was a plan being executed. They had known his fleet was coming. They had known roughly how many ships he would have. They had known what a PVI fleet's first move would be in a new system. They had planned around all of it. His intelligence officer, a thin and careful woman named Hearthsave, came to him with a single piece of data that she had pulled from the sensor logs. During the engagement, the Unyielding had taken 3 direct hits from his ship's primary weapons, 3 hits that should have disabled it. The Unyielding was still operational, Hearth told him. Why? The ship's shield configuration was not standard. It had been modified specifically to counter the frequency range that PVANI plasma weapons used. Someone had studied how PVI weapons worked and had built a defense that was unusually effective against them, as Shreth asked her when those modifications would have had to be made to the ship. She said at least 2 years ago, based on the engineering involved. 2 years ago, before any human and Council ship had ever fired at each other, before this war had officially existed. Shurath sent his report to the Council command ship without editorializing. He listed the ship losses, the tactical outcome, and the shield modification data at the very end of the report. Because he felt he had a professional duty to say it, he added one observation. He wrote, "The humans were expecting us. They studied us before we arrived. Their defensive systems were built specifically to counter our weapons. They allowed us to fire first. I do not know why they allowed us to fire first, but I do not believe it was because they had no choice." He sent the report and then he sat in his command chair for a while, thinking about that last part. He thought about a species that had been watching the Council long enough to study its weapons and build counter systems. He thought about 12 ships sitting cold and dark in an asteroid field, waiting in exactly the right positions while 300 warships scanned the system and found nothing. He thought about Commander Vasquez's face, the calm, the patience, the way she had given him 30 seconds, and the strong impression that she had known he wouldn't use them wisely. He thought about the fact that this was only the advanced fleet. The main force of the Council's armada was still 2 weeks away. He wondered for the first time since this mission had begun whether 30,000 ships was actually enough. He did not write that thought in any report. He simply sat with it in the silence of his command ship while the battered remains of his advanced fleet held position at the edge of a solar system that had turned out to be a great deal more prepared for visitors than anyone had expected. Back in the inner system, aboard the USCS Unyielding, Commander Vasquez stood down her crew from battle stations. She accepted the damage reports, confirmed that casualties on the human side had been light, and approved the requests from engineering to begin repairs. Her first officer, a large and steady man named Marcus Cole, came to stand beside her and watch the retreating PVI ships on the long-range display. "They'll call for the main fleet," he said. "Yes," said Vasquez, "we let them go for that reason." Others, she said. Cole was quiet for a moment, so then he said, "Do you think the Council knows yet?" Vasquez looked at the display for a while before she answered. The retreating ships were just dots now, 180 dots, moving away from a system that had chewed through a third of their number in under 20 minutes. "They're starting to figure it out," she said, "Give it a few weeks, they'll." No, she walked off the bridge behind her in the log system. The engagement was recorded under a file that had been created 8 years ago by the United Earth Admiralty, maintained carefully, entitled with the kind of quiet confidence that said more than any speech could. The file was labeled "Anticipated." The main fleet stopped. 30,000 warships hanging in deep space. 2 weeks travel from the Sol system. Engines idling, be waiting for orders. That Grand Admiral Voss of the Keth Dominion was not yet ready to give. He had read Shreth's report. He had read it 3 times. He had then called his senior commanders together and asked them to read it too and tell him what they thought. They told him what he already suspected. The advanced fleet engagement was not a fluke. It was a signal. Before he moved 30,000 ships into a system that had already proven it could hurt a fleet that came in unprepared. He wanted to know more. He gave the Council's intelligence division 2 weeks. The intelligence division, led by a meticulous and deeply unhappy analyst named Counselor PTH, took the 2 weeks and produced a report that was by the standards of intelligence documents. Unusual. It was unusual because it did not reassure anyone. Most intelligence reports wait, even the honest ones tried to end on a note that justified whatever action was already planned. PTH's report did not do this. It began with a discovery that nobody had wanted to make for the last 80 years. Earth had been listening. The Council's communication network spanned hundreds of systems and carried billions of messages a year. It was encrypted, but the encryption was old and comfortable, the kind that had not been seriously challenged in centuries, because nobody outside the Council had the technology to intercept deep space transmissions at the range and volume required. It was the kind of security that comes not from strength but from the assumption that no one is trying. Someone had been trying, buried in a thick cloud of debris at the edge of a System 6 light years from Earth. It, disguised as a cluster of dead rock and ice, was a listing station. The Council's analysts found it only because they were specifically looking for it after the battle, and even then it took 11 days. It had been there for over 80 years. It was human-built. It was human-operated remotely by a rotating team of personnel whose existence had been carefully kept out of any public record for 80 years. This station had been intercepting Council communications, not all of them. The station's range and processing capacity meant it could only capture a fraction of total traffic, but it had been doing this steadily, consistently, for 8 decades, and what it had captured had been analyzed, translated, categorized, and fed into what PH's team now understood to be an enormous and extremely well-organized intelligence archive on Earth. The humans knew about the Council's major military campaigns. Going back 70 years, they knew the general structure of Council governance. They knew the political tensions between member species. They knew which alliances were strong and which were held together by mutual self-interest that could break under pressure. They knew about the vote to send the fleet. They had almost certainly known about it within days of the vote being taken. They had not been surprised by the fleet's arrival. They had been waiting for it. PTH paused in the briefing and gave the assembled commanders time to absorb that. Then he moved to the second finding, which was worse: the weapons. The Unyielding's modified shields were not an isolated case. When PTH's team began going back through the sensor data from the battle with fresh eyes, looking for things that hadn't seemed important, at the time they found a pattern. Every human ship in that engagement had carried systems that were specifically optimized to reduce the effectiveness of Council weapons. The unyielding shields were tuned against P-Vanny plasma frequencies the other ships carried. Point defense systems calibrated to intercept Keth pattern missile guidance signals. Their ECM suite, the electronic package designed to blind enemy sensors, was built around a very specific understanding of how Porvani sensor arrays process data. None of this was generic. None of this was the kind of broad-spectrum defense you built when you didn't know who you were going to be fighting. This was targeted, specific, detailed. The humans had studied Council weapons technology for decades and had built their defenses around the specific weaknesses they had identified. One of the senior commanders, a Hearth fleet admiral named Das, asked the obvious question: if the humans had been observing the Council for 80 years, why hadn't they made contact? Why had they let the Council remain unaware of them for so long? PTH said he believed the answer was straightforward. The humans hadn't been ready yet. They had been learning. Every year of those 80 years had been data collection, not just military data, everything: species, biology, political relationships, economic systems, resource distribution, the history of every major conflict the Council had fought in the last century. They had been building a complete picture of the galaxy's dominant power from the outside, unseen, taking notes. Then, when they judged the time was right, they had launched their colony ships and begun to expand. They had not hidden their expansion. They had done it openly, knowing the Council would notice, and when Council patrol ships had intercepted them and asked questions, the humans had been polite and curious and completely unaware, studying the Council, and had a very clear sense of what the Council was capable of and what it was not. The third finding was the one that made the room go quiet. PTH called it the iteration problem. In the 2 weeks since the Advanced Fleet battle, which human shipyards across the Sol system had been in a state of intense activity, the Council's long-range sensors pushed to their maximum range could see the thermal signatures of manufacturing at a scale that suggested full wartime production. That alone was expected. What was not expected was the speed. In 2 weeks, the configuration of ships coming out of human construction facilities had already changed. Engineers on Pet's team, who specialized in propulsion and weapons design, had compared what they could see now to what they had seen at the start of the engagement. The new ships had different engine profiles, different weapon mount positions, different hull geometries. They were already building ships designed around what they had learned in the 19 minutes of the first battle. 2 weeks, which the Council's own weapons development cycle from engagement data to meaningful design changes ran between 8 and 15 years, not because the Council's engineers were slow, because that was simply how long it took to do the work properly, the material sciences, the manufacturing tolerances, the testing requirements. It was a long process. The humans had done something meaningful. 2 weeks did not speculate in his report about what they would have done in 2 months or 2 years. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room could do that math themselves. Admiral Das had been sitting very still throughout the briefing. She now asked the question that everyone else was thinking, but that no one wanted to say out loud: if everything in this report was accurate. And she had no reason to think it wasn't, however, then what exactly was the Council's advantage in this war? PTH considered the question carefully. Before answering numbers, he said the Council had a very large fleet, human production, even at the rate they were currently working, could not match 30,000 warships in any near-term time frame. Numbers remained the Council's primary advantage. Das asked if numbers had been the K's primary advantage when they fought the Borvani 700 years ago, and whether the Keth fleet had been double the Borvani size at the start of that war. PTH said yes to both. Das said, and how did that end? PTH said, nothing. Everyone in the room knew how it had ended. The KE had won, but it had taken 40 years and cost them 2/3 of their original fleet against a species that had been completely unprepared for the conflict and that had no pre-existing knowledge of KE weapons or tactics, and that had no time to adapt before the war's momentum was already decided. The humans had none of those disadvantages. That evening, Grand Admiral Voss sat alone in his quarters and reread PTH's report from beginning to end one more time. He was a practical man. He had built his career on clear thinking and honest assessment. He could tell himself the numbers still favored the Council. He could tell himself that 30,000 ships against whatever the humans could put into the field in the short term remained an overwhelming advantage, but he had been in 6 major fleet engagements in his career, and he had learned the hard way that the side with more ships did not always win. What mattered was what happened to each side over the course of the war, and which side learned faster, which side adapted faster, which side could absorb losses and come back stronger, and which side simply had fewer ships every time the fighting stopped. He thought about the listening station in the debris cloud. 80 years of patience, 80 years of watching and learning and building a picture that had to be as complete as anything the Council had on itself. He thought about the shields on the unyielding, specifically tuned to PVY plasma frequencies. He thought about human ships already being redesigned too. Weeks after the first engagement, he made a decision not to stop the war. Council's political structure made that very difficult, even if he wanted to. And he was not sure yet that he did, but he needed more information before he moved this fleet. He called PTH back and gave him a new assignment. He wanted to know everything about the system surrounding Sol, the asteroid belt, the gas giant moons, the approach corridors. He wanted to know what the humans had been building out there and for how long, and what it would mean for a fleet trying to get to the inner system. PTH returned 4 days later looking like a man who had not slept and did not expect to sleep for some time. He laid out the data on the table between them without speaking. First, Voss looked at the data. He looked at it for a long time, then he leaned back and looked at the ceiling of his quarters for a while. PTH had found that the asteroid belt had been systematically modified over a period of more than 30 years, hollowed out sections, reinforced interiors, power signatures consistent with heavy weapon systems. The gas giant moon showed similar construction, automated mass drivers on Titan, weapons platforms disguised as scientific stations around Jupiter. Sensor networks woven through the entire outer system so comprehensively that anything entering Sol space on any trajectory would be detected within minutes. The humans had not built this when the fleet arrived. They had not built it in a panic when their listening station told them the vote had passed. They had been building it for 30 years, at least. How long have they been expecting an attack? Voss asked. PTH said he didn't think it was specifically an attack they had been preparing for. He thought the humans had simply decided at some point a few decades ago that if a conflict ever came, when they wanted to fight it on their terms in their system with every possible advantage prepared in advance. He paused. Then he said the thing that had clearly been sitting with him for the 4 days since he'd found this data. He said they didn't prepare this because they were afraid. They prepared it because they are thorough. Voss sat with that for a while, outside in the dark between stars. 30,000 council warships waited for orders. 2 weeks out from a solar system that had been quietly, patiently, and very thoroughly preparing for their arrival for 30 years. Voss pulled up a fresh command document and started writing. Not an attack order, not yet. Something more complicated. He had started to understand that this war was going to be unlike anything the Council had fought before. Not because the humans were necessarily stronger, but because every single thing he'd learned in the last 2 weeks pointed to the same conclusion. The humans had not started preparing when the war started. They had been ready long before either side knew there was going to be a war, and that changed everything. Grand Admiral Voss gave the order to advance on a gray morning ship time when the fleet's idling engines had been burning fuel for nearly a month, and the mood across 30,000 warships had turned restless and uncertain. He did not give the order because he was confident. He gave it because the Council was watching, because the political pressure from the Keth Dominion had become impossible to ignore, and because sitting still was not making anything better. He had prepared as well as he could. When he had studied PTH's reports, he had restructured his fleet formations 3 times based on what he learned about the Sol system's defensive layout. He told himself it was enough. He was not sure he believed it. The fleet entered the outer system in tight formation, sensors running at full capacity, every ship on high alert. For the first 2 hours there was nothing, no contact, no hail, no movement from the human ships that the Council's long-range scans had placed in the inner system. The outer system was cold and quiet and full of rocks. Then the rocks started shooting. The asteroid belt opened up first. Not the entire belt at once, but in a sequence near a rolling wave of fire that moved from the fleet's left flank across its front and made the lead formation scatter in 3 different directions just to survive the first 30 seconds. The mass drivers were not energy weapons. They fired physical rounds, dense and fast, designed to punch through shields by sheer kinetic force rather than by overwhelming their power curve. The Council's shields had been built to absorb energy. Physical impacts at high velocity were a different problem. The fleet's lead formation lost 9 ships in the first minute. Voss ordered a counter-strike on the belt positions. His ships fired into the rocks, trying to identify and destroy the mass driver platforms. Some of them found targets. Some of them found empty caverns that the humans had apparently blasted out and then never filled with anything as specifically to absorb weapons fire and make the targeting problem worse. While the fleet was dealing with the belt, the gas giant arrays came online. Jupiter's moons were further away, but the human engineers had solved that problem with patience and math. The mass drivers on the moons were enormous, the size of valleys, running along the surface of the rock for kilometers before launching their payloads. The rounds they fired traveled for millions of km and hit with more force than anything Boss Fleet had encountered in any war they had fought. His shields could handle it, but handling it cost power that was supposed to be available for weapons and movement. And in a different part of the battle, the human warships that were now coming out of the inner system toward the Council fleet, and there were more human ships than the earlier intelligence had estimated. Significantly more. The new ones were the ships built in the 2 weeks of frantic construction, and they were visibly different from the older ones. Sleeker, the weapon ports were repositioned. Their movements as they came out of the inner system were faster than the earlier models in ways that Voss's tactical AOI and III flagged as consistent with upgraded propulsion. 2 weeks. Those ships had been designed and built in 2 weeks. The human fleet did not come at the Council force in a single mass. They split before contact and came in multiple streams, each group targeting a different part of the Council formation, forcing Boss to split his attention across a front that was suddenly much wider than he had planned. For his fleet still outnumbered the humans dramatically, but the humans were fighting with the entire system, not just their ships. The belt was shooting. The moons were shooting. The sensor networks were feeding real-time targeting data to every human gun platform across the whole engagement space. The Council fleet was fighting 30,000 ships versus the entire Sol system. It was not the same thing as fighting 30,000 ships versus the human fleet alone. On his tactical display, Voss watched the numbers move. His ships were taking losses, but so were they. Humans, his losses were higher, but his numbers were still overwhelming. He told himself to hold, told his commanders to press forward. The inner system was still reachable. The human home world was still reachable. Numbers still mattered. Pushed through. Then his communications officer reported something strange. 3 of the human ships had broken off from the main engagement and were moving toward a different part of his fleet, not toward the combat line, toward the rear, toward the command formation, toward the ships that were not actively fighting because they were coordinating, supplying, and providing the communications backbone that held the fleet together. Voss redirected ships to intercept. He had more than enough. The 3 human ships were moving at high speed directly toward his logistics cluster, and that was suicidal. And he had 20 destroyers moving to cut them off. The 3 ships did not slow down when they saw the destroyers. They did not try to fight through them. They went around them in a maneuver that should have been mathematically too tight for their size, burning lateral engines at a rate that his engineers later said should have shaken the ships apart, and they came out the other side of the intercept on a straight course for one specific ship in the logistics cluster, the KAT, Dominion's largest dreadnought, the single most powerful ship in the Council fleet, the ship that carried the primary communications array, the fleets, command-level AI processing cores, and enough weapons to hold off a significant attacking force on its own. Voss did not understand what they were doing until they did it. The three human ships did not fire on the dreadnought. They matched its speed, positioned themselves against its hull in a triangle formation, and his sensors reported a rapid spike of heat along the contact points as something cut through the dreadnought's outer hull in 3 places. Simultaneously, they were boarding it. They were boarding a fully operational KET dreadnought in the middle of an active battle with 3 small ships and what his internal sensors picked up through the hull contact suggested was approximately 47 people. Voss stared at his display. His mind refused to process this correctly because it did not fit any category of military action he had ever encountered. Boarding actions happen when a ship was disabled or surrendered. They did not happen to ships that were fully powered, fully crewed, and fully armed. They did not happen in the middle of a battle. Well, they certainly did not happen when 47 people were going up against a crew of 1,200. He sent internal security teams to the boarding points. He tried to reach the dreadnought's captain. He watched his tactical display while trying to do both of those things at once, and the larger battle kept demanding his attention, and 20 minutes passed, 20 minutes, when the dreadnought's captain finally reached him. The man's voice was flat and controlled, in the way of someone who had been trained for every emergency except the one they were currently experiencing. The bridge had been taken, not the whole ship. The humans had not tried to fight through 200 crew members spread across a kilometer-long warship. They had gone directly to the bridge through a maintenance corridor that the boarding parties had apparently and be memorized from intelligence data before they ever left Earth. They had known the internal layout. They had known the patrol routes. They had known exactly where to go. The captain and his bridge crew were sealed in a side compartment. The 47 humans were on the bridge, and the dreadnought, the most powerful single ship in the Council fleet, was now moving away from the combat zone under human control. It turned at one point and fired its main batteries into a section of Council ships that had been pressing hard on the human fleet's flank. The Council ships scattered. Voss gave the order to shoot the dreadnought down. He hated giving that order. There were 1,200 of his people on that ship, but the alternative was a ship of that size and power in human hands in the middle of his battle line. The order was given, but before it could be executed, the 3 small human ships that had carried the boarding party detached from the dreadnought's hull and brought it to a stop. The communication channels cracked open, and a human voice said in the Council standard language, accented but clear, that the ship was being surrendered back, crew unharmed, in exchange for the Council acknowledging the boarding had taken place. They did not ask for ceasefire. They did not ask for terms. They asked only that the Council acknowledge what had just happened. The acknowledgement was given because Voss did not know what else to say. The humans evacuated the bridge. The dreadnought's captain and crew retook their stations. The 3 human ships burned back to their own line at full speed, passing through the remaining Council intercept attempt without stopping. The battle continued for 3 more hours. At the end of it, the Council fleet had pushed forward, but not through the Sol system's outer Defenses had been partially degraded. The human fleet had lost ships. The Council had lost more. The humans had fallen back to a tighter defensive ring. Around the inner planets, a pause settled over the battlefield that both sides seemed to accept without a formal agreement. Ships held position, guns went quiet, the dead drifted. In the silence, Voss received a report from his intelligence division about the small ship now being tracked, moving away from the human fleet under minimum power, transmitting a simple identification code. It was the captured dreadnought, being returned as promised, its crew unharmed, its systems untouched, except for one thing the humans had. In the 20 minutes they held the bridge, copied the entire contents of the ship's navigational and communications database. They had boarded the most powerful ship in his fleet. They had done it with 47 people. They had accomplished their actual objective without anyone on his side understanding what the objective was until it was done, and then they had handed the ship back because keeping it was never the point. The point was the data. The point was always the information. Voss sat in his command chair, and for a long time he did not speak. Around him his officers moved quietly, managing the fleet's position, tallying losses, running projections. No one disturbed him. They had learned over the years to recognize the look on his face that meant he was working through something that required silence. Worrying, he was thinking about a species that had planned this battle for 30 years, that had built their defenses to specific tolerances, that had designed their ships to counter specific enemy weapons, that had memorized the internal layout of Council warships well enough to take a bridge with 47 people in 20 minutes, that had done all of this not in reaction to a threat, but in preparation for a possibility that they had assessed and worked through decades. Before anyone fired a single shot, he thought about the xenobiologist report that Counselor Drea had mentioned in the chamber, the one about human compulsive problem solving. He thought about how every obstacle gets attacked and broken down and learned from. He thought about what the humans had learned from this battle. He thought about what they were going to build next. Later, when the analyst compiled the official record of the first major battle for the Sol system, one small detail appeared in the footnotes at the end of the combat log. It was a detail that spread through the Council fleet quietly from ship to ship, mentioned in lowered voices and without much commentary, because nobody quite knew what commentary to offer. The dreadnought that had been taken and returned was a KE ship, the KE named their ships according to a formal registry of approved names, each one representing a virtue or equality considered worthy of a warship. When they humans returned it, they had left one small addition to the ship's external identification markings, a name spray painted in rough letters on the hull near the airlock they had used, not the ship's official KE name. It read the Audacity, and then to below that in slightly smaller letters, nice ship. UEA. The second year of the war was quieter than the first. That was not a good sign. When a war goes quiet, it usually means one side is bleeding in ways it isn't advertising. The Council's public communications remained confident. The announcement spoke of tactical repositioning, of strategic patience, of the long-term inevitability of a force 30,000 ships strong finding its way to victory. The announcements did not mention what the numbers actually looked like the numbers look. Like this, in 14 months of active conflict across the Sol system and 3 nearby systems where human colony fleets had engaged, Council advanced forces, the Council had lost approximately 11,000 warships. The humans had lost fewer than 900. The Council's remaining fleet was still enormous by any standard measure. It still outnumbered everything the humans had in open space by a significant margin, but the gap was closing. Every month the humans were building faster, fighting smarter, and absorbing the lessons of each engagement more completely than any enemy the Council had faced in recorded history. Every Council tactic that worked once worked only once. The second time they tried it, the humans had already solved for it. The third time the humans were using a version of the same tactic against them. Counselor PTH had stopped sleeping well. He had a wall in his office covered in data threads, connecting observations and projections and uncomfortable conclusions. He had been looking at that wall for months. Recently, he had stopped adding new threads because the wall was saying the same thing from every direction, and he did not need more data to understand it. He understood it already, he just did not enjoy understanding it. Ambassador Vale of the Keth Dominion still believed in the war. He had been the loudest voice for the initial strike, and he was consistent in his position that the Council simply had not yet committed fully enough. He stood up in Council sessions and pointed at the fleet numbers and said the math was obvious. More ships, more pressure. The humans could not sustain losses at this rate forever. He said this with the confidence of a man who had not looked carefully at the human shipyard data. PTH had looked carefully at the human shipyard data. He had looked at it so carefully that he had eventually asked an independent team to check his work because he thought he must be making an error somewhere. The independent team came back with the same numbers: human industrial output across Earth and Mars and the asteroid belts, converted manufacturing zones, and the Cologne facilities in 3 other systems had quadrupled in 14 months. They were not just building warships, they were building the infrastructure to build more warships, new foundries, new fabrication complexes, new shipyards that were themselves bigger than the previous generation of shipyards. Each month of war was expanding their capacity, not wearing it down. The Keth Dominion, by comparison, was the Council's largest single contributor of warships. They had been building at full wartime production since the beginning of the conflict. Their output had increased by roughly 18%. They were proud of 18%. Among Council species, 18% in wartime was considered excellent. PTH had eventually stopped showing that comparison directly to people because the look on their faces when they saw it was not productive. There was also the question of the alliances. Nobody in the Council's senior leadership had paid much attention to the Turth were a small species, roughly amphibious, who lived in 3 systems on the Council's outer boundary. They had joined the Council 200 years ago under circumstances that were politely described as voluntary and less politely described as the only option available to them after the KE absorbed their neighbors. They paid their Council dues, they attended sessions. They were not particularly powerful or particularly troublesome. 14 months ago, the TZ fleet had not shown up for a scheduled patrol rotation when the Council sent a query. The TER responded with a formal message explaining that they were withdrawing from all active military commitments to the Council and wished to express their neutrality in the current conflict. The Council had been annoyed. It had sent a firmer message. The TER's response to the firmer message had mentioned in careful diplomatic language on that they had recently entered into a mutual defense agreement with the United Earth Admiral Tai and that attacking their fleet would have consequences. The tariff had 11 ships. The Council had not been worried about those 11 ships. They had been worried about what the agreement meant. They had sent people to find out. It was worse than they thought. In the 14 months of the war, human diplomatic teams had been quietly visiting every species the Council had ever pushed around, marginalized, absorbed against their will, or simply ignored. They were not offering military alliances that required these species to fight alongside humanity. They were offering something simpler, a guarantee. If you stand with us, we will make sure no one pushes you around again, not as a subject, as an equal. The Tarth had accepted, and so had the Volley 2 systems. Over. So had the remnant population of the Borvani, a species the KTH had nearly destroyed 700 years ago, and whose remaining communities live scattered and stateless across 4 star systems. So had 6 other species whose names barely came up in Council meetings because they were too small to matter politically. They mattered now, not because of their military contribution, though together they had added nearly 300 ships to the Human Alliance's order of battle. They mattered because of what their choice said. They had been given options. They had chosen humanity. PTH wrote all of this in a report that he titled plainly, Assessment of Current Strategic Position. Tonhai delivered it to Grand Admiral Voss and to the Council's inner committee with the directness of a man who had spent a year being careful about how he said things and had decided to be careful no longer. The assessment said that the Council could not win this war in any time frame that preserved the Council's military and economic capacity. It said that continued conflict would result in human industrial output surpassing the Council's within 18 to 24 months. It said that at current attrition rates, the Council's fleet advantage would be gone within 3 years. It said that the Human Alliance was growing and that the political cost of the war was rising among Council member species who had not signed up for a multi-year grind against an enemy that kept getting stronger. It said, we recommend opening negotiations. The debate that followed in the Council chamber was long and ugly. Vel argued against it with everything he had. He accused PTH of defeatism. He accused other members of cowardice. He said the KTH would fight on alone if the Council lost its nerve. Voss said quietly that he would not advise continuing the war. He listed his reasons in the flat, steady voice of a man who had spent 14 months watching his fleet erode against an enemy that fought better with fewer resources and improved after every single engagement. He did not editorialize. He did not need to. The vote this time was 38-5 in favor of opening a diplomatic channel. It was Vel who was chosen to carry the message, partly because he had started this and it was appropriate that he finish it, and partly because no one else particularly wanted the job. He sent the message. He received a reply. He traveled to a Neutral station at the edge of a system. Neither side had contested and sat down. Across a table from the person the United Earth Admiral had sent to receive him, he had expected someone impressive. A Grand Admiral, a head of state. Someone whose appearance would match the weight of the occasion. He got Admiral Lena Vasquez. She was the same woman. From the unyielding, the one who had given Shreth 30 seconds and watched him waste them. She had been promoted. The insignia on her uniform showed that, but she was otherwise exactly as she appeared in that initial recording. Calm, patient waiting, Val had prepared a speech. It outlined the council's position, established the framework he intended to use for negotiation, and opened with a carefully worded expression of willingness to discuss terms. He had practiced it. It was good. He did not get to give it. Vasquez slid a folder across the table to him before he spoke. She said that she had taken the liberty of drafting a framework. Advance, she thought it might save time. He opened the folder. He read it. He turned the pages slowly, reading everything with the thoroughness of a man who understood that the fine print mattered. The terms were not what he expected. There were no demands for territory, no reparations, no requirement that the council dissolve or restructure its governance. The humans were not asking for the things that victors usually asked for. They were not demanding that Kethfleet be disarmed or the council's military be placed under human oversight. The terms were three things. First one, equal standing for humanity in the council with full voting rights and recognition as a peer civilization rather than a subject or a provisional member. Second, equal standing for all species that had joined the human alliance with the same full rights and protections that founding members enjoyed. Third, one binding agreement that applied to every member of the council without exception now and for any future members. No military action could be taken against any species without a formal attempt at negotiation. First, one attempt that was all that was required. Try to talk first. If it fails, the political and military options remained open, but try first. That was the document. Three things. Vel sat with it for a long time. He turned the pages back and forward. He looked for the catch. He looked for the fine print that took back what the plain language gave. He had spent his career in politics, and he knew that documents this simple usually had something buried in them. He found nothing buried. It was exactly what it said it was. He looked up at Vasquez. He asked her because he genuinely needed to know why these terms. His side had lost 11,000 ships. Her side could have asked for more, could have asked for much more. She looked at him for a moment before she answered. Then she said something that he thought about for the rest of his life. She said that humanity hadn't started this war to conquer anyone. They had started it by existing and expanding and not being afraid of the council. And the council had decided that was a problem that needed to be solved with 30,000 warships. So humanity's goal had never been to rule the galaxy. Their goal was to not be ruled by it. There was a difference. Once that difference was settled, there was no point in asking for more. She paused. Then she said, besides, the species that joined us didn't do it because we promised them conquest. They did it because we promised them fairness. If we win a war for fairness and then act unfairly, we've undermined everything we told them we stood for. We're not interested in being the next KTH Dominion. Val looked at the Document one more time, he thought about the 30 years of fortifications in the asteroid belt, the 80 years of listening stations in deep space, the shields on the unyielding tune to Porvani plasma frequencies before anyone had ever fired a shot, the ships redesigned in 2 weeks, the boarding of the Audacity, the growing coalition of small species that had decided humanity's promise meant something. He thought about the xenobiologist report that had been sitting in a sealed file for years, the part about humans coming from a world that was always trying to kill them, the part about war being a condition they had learned to manage rather than a catastrophe they had learned to avoid. He thought about what Counselor Drea had said at the very beginning before the vote when she had tried to argue against sending the fleet. She had said, "We are not starting a war, we are giving them a deadline." He picked up the signing instrument. His hand was steady. He was not a man who showed weakness easily, and he was not going to start now. He signed the document. The war ended quietly. Way things end when both sides have said everything that needed saying, and there is nothing left to argue about. There were no ceremonies at first. Those came later. The immediate aftermath was mostly administrative. Ships stood down. Positions were established. The new members of the expanded council were formally recognized. The binding clause about negotiation was written into the council's charter in language that every species could read in their own tongue. In the historical record, the official end of what was formerly called the SAW engagement took 3 sentences. A war started, terms were agreed, the terms were signed. The unofficial record was longer. It included pest assessment documents which were later published in full and became required reading in political science courses across a dozen worlds. It included the sensor logs from the advanced fleet engagement which were studied in every military academy the council operated. It included the recording of the KE dreadnought moving away from the battle line under human control, firing into council ships and then returning to its own side unharmed. It included a single photograph taken by a journalist aboard a supply ship of the hull marking the humans had left on the dreadnought, the Audacity. Nice ship, UEA. That photograph spread across the council's communications networks faster than any official announcement. It was not shared because it was important. It was shared because it said something that everyone understood without being able to fully put into words. Something about the kind of species the humans were, not bigger or louder or more impressive than anyone else, but absolutely, completely, unhesitatingly themselves, even in the middle of a battle, even when the galaxy had sent 30,000 ships to make a point, especially. Then Drea read the final terms in her office on the council station. She had not been surprised by them. She had suspected from the moment she read the xenobiologist report years ago that if this conflict ever reached a negotiated end, the humans would not ask for what most species would ask for. They would ask for what they actually wanted. She folded the document and set it on her desk and sat quietly for a while. Then she opened the letter she had started writing on the day the fleet left, the one that began with 4 words, "We have made a mistake." She read it over. It was long. It covered everything she had been thinking in the months between the fleet's departure and this moment. The fear she had felt, the arguments she had lost, the data she had tried to use and been overruled on. She added one more line at the bottom. It read, "The mistake has been corrected. It cost us more than it should have. Remember why it cost so much. Remember that there was a species out there that spent 80 years watching us and learning who we were before they made a single move. Remember that the lesson they learned in all that time was not how to destroy us. It was how to make sure we could never afford to ignore them." She sealed the letter. She marked it for the council's permanent archive after the one that kept the records that were meant to be read in 100 years by people who needed to understand how things had come to be the way they were. She filed it. She stood up. She walked to the observation deck of the station and looked out at the dark between stars. Somewhere out there in a small solar system with one yellow star and 8 planets, a species that had been riding horses 240 years ago was building the next generation of ships and writing the next chapter of their history. They would be joining the council chamber next month for the first session of the new order. They would be sitting at the table that had once voted to destroy them. They were not gloating about it. From everything they had read and seen, that was not something they did. They would simply sit down, introduce themselves properly, suck, and get to work. She thought that was probably the most human thing about them. She stood on the observation deck for a long time. After that, watching nothing in particular, thinking about 80 years of patience and 30 years of preparation and 19 minutes of battle that had announced to the galaxy a simple and permanent fact: the war had been over before it began. The humans had simply been waiting for everyone else to figure that out.